Showtime! Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. It is wonderful to have on tonight. Why is it so wonderful to have such a big live virtual studio audience? Give us all a clap, everybody. Big clap from everyone. Unmute yourselves. Tonight, we are going to be completing Seder Moed, one of the 6 volumes of the Mishnah. And so we are sharing that with the whole Bushy world, the whole Bushy community. We want you all to be able to share in this amazing achievement. We have been studying weekly for nearly a year now, the 2 chapters of Mishnah every single week, and we have reached the final chapter of Seder Moed. We are on chapter 3 of Chagigah. For anyone who wishes to jump onto Zoom and join us, we're going to be starting a brand new Seder tonight, a brand new volume. But for the sake of the completion, for the sake of everyone's amazing achievement, we're going to share with you this final chapter on Facebook tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, join us as we enter the exciting world of chapter 3 of Masechet Chagigah, which of course has some very obscure topics. So let's do what we can, and we'll give it our best shot, and we'll finish the chapter together. We'll finish Seder Moed together, and then if you want to join us for the after party and the very next Seder, we will be back on Zoom. With that in mind, guys, chapter 3. We were talking about the 5 different levels of purity and impurity in the last shir, if you recall, in chapter 2, and we are going to be focusing now on the differences between the 3rd level and the 4th level that we were talking about in the previous chapter, and that is the difference between things which are going to be pure for terumah and things which are going to be pure for sacrifices. Terumah, which was the separation that people made from their produce to give to Kohanim, and Kodesh, which are the items, the animals that would be consecrated to the temple, to the Beis HaMikdash. So these were the most common things that people needed to be pure for, because Kohanim would frequently eat items of terumah, and at the times of the temple, at the very least, everyone would be in some way, shape or form involved with kodshim, with sacrifices. So our first 3 Mishnayot in this chapter are going to talk about 11 stringencies that applied to sacrifices but didn't apply to terumah. So here we go, guys. Nice and easy. The level that was required for sacrifices in the temple, sanctified items in the temple, is stricter than terumah in 11 ways. Here is way number 1. Shemat bilin kalim betoch kalim l'terumah avalo lakodesh. When it comes to immersing vessels that you need to have pure to be able to utilize them for items of terumah, so if you have stacked items, or you get like a few bowls and you put one inside the other, so for terumah you can put those into a mikveh and it will purify them to an acceptable level to use them for terumah. But that's not going to be the case for kodshim. So terumah, which is a bit less severe than sacrifices, because the water pressure could allow the water to get between the different vessels, that's going to be sufficient for terumah. But for sacrifices, for kodesh, for items that are sanctified to the Beis HaMikdash, we are concerned that the water is not going to penetrate all the different parts of the vessels. And so that is why number 1 stringency is you can immerse kalim, you can immerse vessels that are stacked inside of each other for the sake of using it for terumah, but that's not going to be effective for kodshim. That's number 1. As we move on to number 2, when it comes to these rabbinic levels of impurity, so the halacha is that vessels are split into 3 different entities. There's the inside of the vessel, there's the outside surface of the vessel, and there's the handle. So if you imagine a saucepan, for example, So you've got the inside surface of the saucepan, you've got the outside surface of the saucepan, and the handle. These function as three different entities, right? So the question is going to be, if you have something that needs to be purified so that you can use it for teruma, do you need to immerse the whole thing, or can you just dunk in the bit that is problematic? In different instances, in different cases, it might be that only part of the vessel needs to be purified. So it's going to depend. If it's for teruma, then that's going to be sufficient. If it's for kodshim, that's not going to be sufficient. So the Mishnah tells us, number 2, achorayim. I just realized I'm not sharing the screen, guys. Come on. Pipe up over there. Don't be strangers. So the Mishnah tells us right here on line 2, achorayim v'toch uveis hatzvita. So achorayim is the outer surface, toch is the inner surface, uveis hatzvita is the handle. So batruma, you are going to be able to immerse the different entities, just the part that has become tameh. But when it comes to kodshim, you have to immerse the whole vessel. You have to immerse the whole kli. Moving on to number 3. So we've talked about tumas medras, which is a type of impurity which is transmitted by people sitting on items. So you could have somebody who is in their menstrual cycle, someone who has the status of a zav, of a zava, and if they sit on cushions or chairs or surfaces, they are going to transmit impurity to those items. And the Mishnah is telling us that they become tameh to the point of a rishon l'tumah. They have a first level tumah rather than an avha tumah, which is the highest. They are a rishon, first level tumah. Now, is that a question? No. So if something which is a rishon l'tumah, or if a person is a rishon l'tumah, and he is carrying something pure in an earthenware vessel, which can only be contaminated from the inside, so he's not going to contaminate it, strictly speaking, by holding it on the outside. So the Mishnah is going to tell us that he is not going to contaminate it for the sake of teruma, but he is going to contaminate it for kodesh, because he might touch the kodesh item inside and he will contaminate it. But we're not concerned about that to such an extent, because it is a very strict stringency. We're not concerned about that for teruma. So the Mishnah says, Hanoise es hamidras, one who is carrying an item which has come into contact with someone sitting on it, no say es truma. He can carry truma still, because it's not going to contaminate it from the inside, airspace, but midras lakodesh. But it is going to contaminate it for an item of kodesh. Continues the Mishnah. Lo kamidas hakodesh midas hatruma. The extent to which we have to be concerned about teruma is not the same as the level as we need to be for kodesh. Why? Sheba kodesh matir u'menagev u'matbil va'achar kosher. When it comes to immersing clothing into a mikveh to purify it, so do you have to unravel all of the knots so the water can penetrate any knots? You know, imagine dunking your tzitzit, yeah, or your talit. So do you have to untangle all of the knots so the water can penetrate it, or not? So the Mishnah says by teruma, which is more lenient. Sorry, let's start with kodesh, which is stricter. You have to untie everything. You have to dry it all out. You have to immerse it, and then you have to tie it all back again, because we're stricter with regards to kodesh. Uvat teruma kosher v'achar kach matbil. But with teruma, you don't need to do that. With teruma, you can just tie it up and put it in, and you don't have to be concerned that the water's not going to penetrate and reach those hard to reach areas. So that is Mishnah Aleph. As we move into Mishnah Beis, we continue with our list of 11 stringencies. So to introduce this next part, to be able to contaminate and to be able to transmit the tumah, to be able to be contaminated with tumah, the vessel that we're talking about has to be a halachic vessel. It has to be completed. It has to be finished. It has to be in a state of completion for it to be capable of being contaminated. So the Mishnah says, "Kalim haligmarim b'tahara." If you have vessels which have been completed, they are fully fledged vessels, and they've been completed in a state of purity. So the Mishnah says, "Tzrichin tavila lakodesh." They still nonetheless need to be immersed to be considered pure for usage with kodesh items, avalol truma, but not with teruma items. We can be a little bit more lenient. Hakli. What if you've got multiple items and one of them becomes impure, one of them becomes tameh, but they're not necessarily touching anything? So if they're not touching anything, then the other items are going to be fine. If they are touching other items, then it's going to depend whether you're talking about needing to use it for truma or needing to use it for kodesh. So the Mishnah says, "Hakli metzaref ma shebatocho la kodesh." When it comes to kodesh, we're going to be strict, and items, kalim, vessels, are going to be able to combine with regards to the things that are inside it. They're going to combine for sacrificial items, sacrificial foods, aval lo truma, but they're not going to combine when it comes to teruma. We are now on number 8 of our list of 11. So officially, a person cannot be contaminated to a derived state of impurity below a rishon latuma. So strictly speaking, a person cannot really be, so that would mean that a person can't be contaminated further, touching other items, can't be contaminated further than a rishon latuma. Food can be contaminated by one step further away. They can become a sheni latuma. And what we're going to see is that there's a status of a shlishi latuma, which is a tertiary one step away from the original source of tumah. And then kodesh, these sacrificial items, can be contaminated to a 4th level. Meaning, if you've got a corpse and a person touches a corpse, they become a rishon latuma. If that person now touches some food, that food is going to become a sheni latuma, right? One step away from the original contaminant source. Okay, if that food now touches an item of teruma, so biblically there should be no problem. It shouldn't contaminate further. But for the sake of teruma, it can be contaminated to a 3rd level. And then if that teruma touches sacrificial items, so officially no harm done. Biblically, no harm done. But there's this extra level. It can be contaminated even to the 4th derivative level of impurity. So the Mishnah says, Haravi bakodesh pasul, that if sacrificial items become contaminated, even if they are 4 steps removed from the original source of impurity, they're going to be invalid for use in the Beis Hamikdash. V'hashlishi b'truma, and for truma, we're 1 step lenient. So if they are 3 steps removed from the original source of impurity, they're going to be invalid as well. Moving on to number 9. So biblically, only a body can become impure, but rabbinically, our hands can become impure as well for the sake of teruma. So the Mishnah says, "Uvat teruma im nitmeis achas miyadav." If one of your hands became contaminated with a from touching something which was a sheni latuma, so chaverta tahora, the other hand, if it hasn't touched, is still going to be pure. So one of your hands might be impure, but you can still handle teruma with your other hand. Uva kodesh, when it comes to sacrificial items, matbil shteihem. If only one of them became impure, they both still have to be immersed and purified. Shehiyad metame es chaverta bakodesh, because one hand contaminates the other, even if they don't come into physical contact by sacrificial items. Avalo but teruma, but not with teruma items. That was number 9. So they're going to have to wash their hands in different ways. For teruma, to purify their hands, they have to do netilat yadayim. And for sacrificial items, they're going to have to dunk their hands into a mikvah. But nonetheless, if only one actually came into contact, then it's going to contaminate the other one, even if they don't physically touch. Mishnah Gimel is going to tell us our last 2 stringencies with regards to Kodesh over to Teruma. So number 10, to be able to contaminate, to be able to transmit impurity, the item must have first touched water, must have come into contact with liquid. So there are 7 liquids that can, what we call machshir latuma. It can ready an item to be capable of transmitting tuma. So the 7 liquids off the top of my head, one of them is water, one of them is milk, one of them is honey, one of them is blood, I think one of them is spit, and I'm missing 2. But there are 7 liquids that if they come into contact, they are going to make them ready to become contaminated. They are machshir lekabel tuma. So the Mishnah says that if you have got ochlin, so a person, ochlin, if you are eating food which is neguvim biyadayim, it has been dried, so it's neguvim, it's dry items of food which have never touched liquid, biyadayim mesoavos b'truma, even if they've never touched liquid, so they've never been poised, ready to be contaminated, a person's hands, which are impure, they are dirty, they are not pure for the sake of eating teruma, if they touch these dry items, right, so you've got a teruma apple, you're ready to eat your teruma apple, it's never come into contact with any liquid, it is pure, but your hands are not pure for eating teruma, they still have the power to contaminate the teruma item of food, and you can't now eat it for teruma. But avalo b'kodesh, that is not the case with kodesh, and that is because kodesh is automatically going to be poised and ready to be contaminated. So whatever happens, the kodesh is capable of being contaminated. So it's not just a case of never having touched liquid or not. Number 11, we have the type of person that we've encountered before, an onein. Translates it on the screen as an acute mourner. It's somebody who hasn't yet had the chance to bury their close relative. So an onein is not allowed to eat anything or take part in kodshin, and they are not going to need to go to a mikveh to be able to take part in teruma. So the Mishnah says ha'onein, this mourner, u'mechusa kippurim, somebody who has been impure, he went to the mikveh in the morning, and he just needs to wait till nightfall before he is considered 100% pure. Nonetheless, the Mishnah tells us, tzrichin tevila la kodesh, they are both going to need to go to the mikveh to have the ability to eat sacrificial items, even though the mechusa kippurim, he's lacking atonement, he just needs to wait till the night time to be able to complete his process. So he's already been to the mikveh. The Mishnah is telling us for sacrificial items he needs to go to the mikveh again, and that is because there could have been a lapse in his concentration. He could have come into contact with something which was impure, so he needs to go to the mikveh again. And for an onein, he has to go to the mikveh for the first time. Aval lo letruma, this is not a stringency that is applied for them to be able to eat items of teruma. Now we move on to Mishnah Daled, and we're going to reverse it. We're going to talk about things where, areas where teruma is more strict than kodshin. And we're going to see a few different types over here. So you might think, well, why is teruma stricter in any area if it's that one step lighter than sacrificial items? The reason why we have to be strict about teruma is because we have to be worried that other people are going to have done things wrong. So we have talked in the past about people who have a status of an am ha'aretz, people who might not be so well versed in the laws and may not be so strict about purity and impurity and keeping things in a state of purity. So we're going to see that there are some instances where we can trust an am ha'aretz and take their word for it, and there are going to be areas where we can't trust their word, and we have to treat it in a particular way. So the Mishnah says, Chomer b'truma, there are things which are stricter for truma than they will be for sacrificial items. Shabi Yehuda, in the area, in the region of Judah, right, which is quite in central Israel, near to Jerusalem. Should be Yehuda. Ne'emanim al taharas yayin v'shemen kol yemos hashana. We are going to be able to trust everybody, whether they are extremely frum or whether they are an am haaretz. We're going to be able to trust them and take their word that they have kept wine and oil pure all the days of the year. Why? Because oil and wine were so important and in such regular use in the Beis Hamikdash. So we are going to trust them that if something is going to end up in the Beis Hamikdash, we're going to trust them to say that we're going to trust them to say that they've kept it in a state of purity and it can be used in the Beis Hamikdash. We trust people for that. What if it's not meant to get to the Beis Hamikdash? What if it's meant to just be used as items that will be sold to a Kohen for Terumah? Okay, so somebody has separated oil and it's Terumah and it can only go to a Kohen, or they've separated wine and it can only go to a Kohen for Terumah. Can you trust an Am Haaretz with this? So the Mishnah is going to tell us it depends what time of year. Bishas hagitos v'habadim afala Terumah. If it's at the time when it's the right season to press the grapes, to press the olives, and to make the wine and the oil, then you can trust them to say that they have separated Terumah. And that's because if they didn't make it pure, then a Kohen could get into all sorts of trouble for having these things. So in this pressing season, we can trust them. The Mishnah says though, Avru hagitos v'habadim. If this were beyond the time period now where people would typically press grapes and press olives, v'heviu lo chavis shel yain shel Terumah, and now you're presented with a barrel of wine or a barrel of oil of Terumah from an Am Haaretz, someone who really you shouldn't be able to trust, lo yikablenu mimenu. You shouldn't take it from him. You shouldn't accept it. But, says the Mishnah, aval manicha legas haba, they could go and leave it till the next year, and then when it's the time period for pressing again, then you can take their word for it. Ultimately, what we have to hope is that people are going to be honest and understand the severity and understand how important it was for people to be able to trust the produce that they were getting. But there is this almost loophole to be able to rely on so that the people who are regarded as an Am Haaretz are still going to be able to sell these things on. So they can trust them if they've left it over till the next opportunity, the next season. So the Mishnah says, V'im amar lo, and if at any point of the year he says to him, Hifrashti latocha revi'is kodesh, that he has separated from within this this wine or this oil, he's separated a revi'is for sacrificial usage, then ne'eman, he can be trusted again because he has, meaning that if he tells us he has separated some for use in the Beis Hamikdash, then we can also believe him with regards to Terumah as well. What about the actual jugs or the actual barrels? Can we trust them for that? So we might be able to trust them for oil. We might be able to trust them for wine. Does that mean that we can trust them for the barrel as well? That the barrel has been kept in a state of purity so that the oil or the wine has not been contaminated? So what about that? So the Mishnah says, Kadei yayin v'kadei shemen hamadumaos. If you've got barrels of wine or you've got barrels of oil which have items which have been separated for Terumah, but you are concerned that other things have fallen into them, they have this mixed status. So can you trust them? Mishnah says, you can trust them if it's at the pressing season of wine and of oil. Or or 70 days before this, because they're starting to get ready and realize that this is a very busy time. This is a time of great importance to keep things pure. And so 70 days beforehand, you could already trust them to be keeping their barrels in a state of purity, even though they themselves might not be the most trustworthy individuals because of their levels of observance. We move on to Mishnah Hay. Another fascinating idea over here. So even though we don't trust them for their vessels, for their jugs, we would still trust them if they were within a certain perimeter of Jerusalem. Trust them if they were in a certain perimeter around Jerusalem, because they didn't actually make these vessels within a certain perimeter of Jerusalem. If you were close to Yerushalayim, you wouldn't be allowed to be making these kalim because you couldn't have the furnaces. The furnaces could end up pumping smoke towards Yerushalayim, and if they're pumping smoke towards Yerushalayim, that could blacken the walls and the streets and make Yerushalayim look like an unattractive place. So there was a kind of buffer zone around Jerusalem, and beyond that, the immediate areas, those would be the prime hotspots to be making the vessels for usage in Jerusalem. So the Mishnah says, "Min ha-modiyis v'lifnim." If you were from, the perimeter, as it were, around Jerusalem, the distance up to Modi'in, if you were within that distance, ne'emanin al kli cheres, you can trust all of the earthenware vessels that they've been kept in a state of purity because you're so close to Jerusalem itself. And these vessels need to be used for the temple, so you can trust people, even if they might not seem so trustworthy. So, where am I? Min ha-modiyis v'lifnim ne'emanim al klei cheres. You can trust them for their earthenware vessels. Min ha-modiyis v'lachutz. If you are dealing with vendors of earthenware vessels from Modi'in and outwards, then you can't trust them. So the Mishnah asks, Ketzad, how is this to be understood? Hakadar shehu mocher hakaderis. You've got a potter who is selling pottery, selling these vessels. So, nichnas lifnin min ha-modiyis. If he comes within Modi'in to be able to sell these items, hu hakadar, vehen hakaderos, vehen ha-loikchin, ne'eman. Then the potter, the pots, the customers, they are all going to be trusted. They're all going to be credible people or items that can be trusted for use in the Beis HaMikdash. But Yatzar, if they go out, so even if they live within the perimeter, but they go out of Modi'in, outside of these boundaries to be able to sell, so even if within the boundaries they are very trustworthy, outside of the boundaries they're not going to be credible anymore. So you have to be either making them within that boundary or bringing them to within that boundary. But if there are sales of vessels going on within that boundary, then we're going to be able to trust them. We move on to Mishnah Vav. We are going to talk about a tax collector and a robber being trusted for having touched items, and whether we can use them for teruma, whether we can use them for sacrificial items. So the Mishnah says, Hagabayim, if you have a tax collector, he's entered into somebody's house. Why has he entered into somebody's house? Because he is going to have to collect items in lieu of tax payment. So I can't think what the wording is, but he is he comes in, the guy owes 100 quid to taxes, he's not paying up, the tax collector will go in and he will take 100 quid's worth of items from the house. So if you've got this tax collector going into the house, or v'chein haganovin shehechaziru es ha'kenin, you have thieves who are returning items to the person from whom he had stolen, then ne'emanim lomar lo naganu. We can trust their word. If they say, these are the items that I took, and I did not touch anything else in the house, then those items remain pure. You can trust the word of a tax collector, and you can trust the word even of a thief who is returning the items that he had stolen. He can be trusted to say, I didn't touch anything else in the house other than the items that I took. Uv'Yerushalayim ne'emanim ala kodesh. In Jerusalem, then you can trust everybody to tell the truth, that they have kept things pure for sacrificial usage. Uvishas haregel afala truma. And if it's during one of the shalosh regalim, you can even trust them to tell the truth that that the items that are for teruma have been kept pure as well. Mishnah Zayin. We're getting ever closer, guys, to the end of Maseches Chagigah. Says the Mishnah, Haposeach es chavisa. You've got a shopkeeper selling wine, and he opens up his barrel to be able to sell his wine during Yom Tov. V'hamaschil be'isaso al gav. Or you've got a guy who has made dough during one of the Shalosh Regalim. And remember, you've got everybody coming up to Jerusalem for the 3 festivals. How are you going to be possibly able to check and trust that every single person coming into your shop is in a state of ritual purity. How can you trust? You got millions of people coming to Jerusalem. So if a guy opens up his wine, potentially leaving it exposed and able to be contaminated, the same with dough. You've got bakers who would make tremendous amounts of dough, and anybody could be coming into contact with these items. So what's the alternative? That they're not going to prepare stuff because they're afraid that people will touch it. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yigmor. Rabbi Yehuda says that even if you open up this barrel of wine, even if you make all of this dough, Yom Tov finishes, all of these potential Amei Haaretz, they leave Jerusalem, are you still allowed to sell these items and consider it to be in a state of purity? It's almost certainly potentially being contaminated. Do we waive the rules because of this? Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, we do. We waive the rules, and even though it may not be in a state of purity, we will consider it to be pure. Why? Because if not, then people are going to be hesitant to let people into their shop. They're going to be hesitant to sell their produce or to make their produce. So for that reason, Rabbi Yehuda has a very lenient approach in order to facilitate people being able to do this. So even after Yom Tov, even after everyone's cleared out, Rabbi Yehuda says you can still finish up that stock. The Chachamim say you are not going to be you're not going to be able to do this. It's going to have to be discarded. There's just no way of proving and demonstrating that these items are still definitely pure. Continues the Mishnah. Mish'ava Haregal. After a festival would finish, so you've had people traipsing through your temple, through your Beis HaMikdash. You've got no idea what could be good and what might now be impure. So the Mishnah says, Ma'avirin al taras hazara. We are now going to clean up the whole Beis HaMikdash. We are going to purify everything because we just don't know what has happened. Avar haregel bayom shishi. If the festival finished on a lo hayu ma'avirin, then they're not going to do it on a Friday. They'll wait till after Shabbos, mipnei kavod Shabbos, in order to give due respect to Shabbos. They won't do this process on a Friday, but they'll wait till after Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af lo b'yom chamishi. Even if Yom Tov finishes on a Thursday, they're not going to start the process. She'ena kohanim penuyim, because the kohanim are not available. Why are they not available? Because they need to go and get haircuts, they need to go and shave, they need to go and wash their clothes. They've not been able to do this over the Yom Tov, so we have to give them the opportunity to get themselves back in a fit state to be presentable. Guys, Mishnah Ches is the last Mishnah of Maseches Chagigah. Strap in, here we go. How did they do the overhaul? What a tremendous job it must have been to purify the Beis HaMikdash after a Yom Tov. How did they do it? Keitzad ma'avirin al taharas hazara. How do they go about purifying the Azara, the Beis HaMikdash, making all these vessels pure again? It says the Mishnah, Matbilin es hakelim shahayu b'mikdash. They would immerse the vessels that were used in the Beis HaMikdash. Va'omerin lahem, and they would say, because does that mean everything or not? So the Mishnah says, Hizaharu shelo tigu b'shulchan. Make sure not to touch the shulchan, the table where they had the 12 loaves of bread that would last from 1 week to the next. So you always have to be having lechem hapanim, this bread, these loaves of bread on show. So you don't want to have to be in a situation where that gets contaminated. So they were saying to be careful not to touch the table. And so that was kept out of the way. It says also in brackets, uvam nora, and the same with the menorah as well. Utatamu, because we have to be careful that they don't become contaminated. So everything else, the bowls, the the knives, all of these things, all these vessels that were used in the Beis HaMikdash, they would all have to be immersed in the mikveh and purified for future use. Says the Mishnah, what are you going to do while you're doing this? All the vessels that were in the Beis HaMikdash, yesh lehem shneim ushlishim. So all of the things that were used in the Beis HaMikdash, they had substitutes. They had second substitutes, third substitutes. Why? She'im nitmu arishonim, because if the first set got contaminated, yaviu shneim tachtehim, then you could bring in the second set and not have to worry that there's things that you can't use in the Beis HaMikdash. There were always spares that were kept in a state of purity, so that if anything became contaminated, they would have readily available stock and merchandise, or whatever the word is, to be able to keep going. Says the Mishnah again, Kol HaKelim Shahayu B'Mikdash, all of the vessels in the base of Mikdash, Tu'unin Tevila. They would require Tevila, they would require immersion in the mikveh after the Chag, after the festival, to be able to have them ready for use again. Chutz Memizbeach HaZahav Memizbeach HaNachoshes, with the exception of the golden altar, which they burnt the incense on, that was within the Heichal of the Beis HaMikdash, and the Mizbeach HaNachoshes, the bronze altar, which is the main altar out in the courtyard where they processed all the animals. These things are attached to the ground. Mipnei shehen kakarka. They are considered to be part of the ground, a permanent piece of furniture. And a permanent piece of furniture, Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that is the reason why they did not require immersion, because the ground is not susceptible to tumah. Anything attached to the ground is not susceptible for tumah. And so these two items would not need to be immersed in the mikveh. V'chachamim omrim, the last words of our Seder Moed, v'chachamim omrim, the sages say, Mipnei shehin metzupin. These items, these two altars, one would be plated with gold, one would be plated with copper, and so these things make them not susceptible to tumah, and so they would not need to be immersed, and they would not need to be purified for usage again. Guys, let's unmute ourselves and say to the whole of Facebook and the whole of Bushi and the whole of YouTube, join me. Nishlama Maseches Chagigah. Nishlama, you're not doing it, guys. They're going to think no one's here. Nishlama Maseches Chagigah. Nishlama Maseches Chagigah. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing Maseches Chagigah. And the other word is Hadron Alach Seder Moed. Hadron Alach Seder Moed. Hadron Alach Seder Moed. Guys, this is a huge, huge achievement. You have completed Seder Moed, this entire book. It is phenomenal. We should be so, so proud of ourselves. To everyone watching on Facebook, we are going to stop the recording for Facebook. We're continuing on with Seder Kodshin, more about sacrifices. It's very, very exciting. Come join us. But for now, everyone on Facebook, we wish you all good night. Mazel tov to our amazing clan. If I can just remove the spotlight, put it on gallery view, give Facebook a wave, guys. And we haven't finished yet, but as far as Facebook is concerned, we have done. Okay, now I need to transfer over here. We're going to end the broadcast also on YouTube.